You have a friend who moved to the UK many years ago. Now you'd like to know precisely the period of time he spent there. What question would you ask him? Are you translating into your head? Are you unsure about the grammar, the vocabulary, the word order? Are you not really confident about your pronunciation? Well, these are all signs that it's time for you to create language automatisms so that you can use what you know in real-life situations. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how to do that, step by step. I'm Terasela, qualified English teacher, fluency coach, and founder of FluencyRoutine. And I have a single purpose: teach you how to bridge the gap between knowing and being able to use the language spontaneously in real-life situations, so that you can go from feeling frustrated to feeling at ease when speaking in English. I've learned English the traditional way, the hard way, because I have spent a lot of time learning about the language instead of learning the language itself. And it took me years to figure out a way to bridge that gap between knowing and being able to use language spontaneously and confidently. Today, it'll take you under 20 minutes to transform your English learning experience and save yourself time, energy, and frustration. Because believe me, knowing how to learn makes the whole difference between knowing something and being able to use something effectively. And the kind of learning habits you develop will determine how long or how short, how difficult and frustrating or how enjoyable your journey towards fluency is going to be. Use the wrong method, and by that I mean translate everything into your head. Memorize grammar rules and lists of vocabulary out of context. Practice in silence, never out loud. Do all that, and in a real-life situation where you want to ask a question, you go blank. And it's understandable, because you cannot expect yourself to apply spontaneously something that you only know about. In the same way, you cannot expect yourself to swim after reading descriptions on how you should swim. So if you use the wrong method, you are not going to be able to use language spontaneously. That will in turn get you very frustrated, disappointed. This will decrease your motivation, your consistency in your practice, and I'm afraid you'll end up giving up. And worse, you'll end up thinking that you lack talent and that you are never going to be able to speak English fluently. When in reality, what you lack is a method, is an effective method, a method that helps you create language automatisms that you can use spontaneously, so that you can sound like a human, not like Google Translate. You know how Google Translate will ask that question to your friend: since when do you live in the UK? Whereas a fluent speaker would say, how long have you been living in the UK for? How long have you been living in the UK for? Why is that? Well, whereas Google Translate translates words into words, we translate thoughts, we translate ideas, concepts into chunks of language, not isolated words, but groups of words, chunks. And then we transform those chunks into sounds. So what is fluency? Fluency is simply your ability to easily put your thoughts into chunks of language and then be able to pronounce that chunk of language clearly and naturally, like a flowing stream of sounds. So if in a real life situation you need to be able to easily access the language you know and produce it as a flowing stream of sounds, when you practice, you need to practice that process, which is totally different from learning a rule or a list of vocabulary out of context. So let's see how you can do that. Well, there are 4 steps you need to go through every time you learn a piece of language. First step, repetition and association. Everything you've learned so far has been through repetition and association, be it a piece of information, piece of language, a behavior. You've learned it by repeating it and by associating it to a familiar situation. So if in a real life situation you want to be able to ask somebody about the period of time they've spent in a certain place, you need to automatically be able to say, how long have you been living in the UK for? How do you make that automatic? By repeating the sounds and by associating this to a specific situation or to the timeline. When you practice this structure, you need to imagine a timeline that goes from the moment your friend moved to the UK up to the present. And the period of time that you are referring to includes the past and the present, because this is an ongoing action. Your friend is still living in the UK and you want to know the period of time, present and past. So you need to associate that part of the timeline to the sounds. How long have you been? How long have you been? How long have you been living in the UK for? You repeat the sounds while associating them to that particular period of time. And pay attention to how I'm saying it. I'm not breaking the chain of sounds. I'm not pronouncing word by word, but I am linking the sounds. How long have you been living in the UK for? There's no pause. There's no break between the sounds. How long have you been living in the UK for? So first step, you repeat the sounds and you associate them to a familiar situation, to something that you want to be able to express. Second step, break it down. You need to break the structure that you want to learn down into fixed parts, those parts that will never change regardless of the context. They will always be there. And variable parts, those parts of the sentence that will change depending on the context. So in our example, how long have you been living in London for? How long have you been is the fixed part, because every time you want to know about the period of time somebody has been doing something for, you need to start your question with how long have you been? How long have you been? This has to be automatic. You want to know about that specific period of time that includes the past and the present. You say, how long have you been? And then you add the verb that you want to use depending on the context. How long have you been living in the UK for? How long have you been studying English for? How long have you been working in this company for? And every time you change context, you also have to imagine that context. Imagine a timeline. Imagine yourself saying that. Imagine your friend living there in the past and in the present. Imagine your friend working there in the past and in the present. Imagine yourself studying English in the past and in the present. So repeat the sounds and associate them to different kinds of situations you would like to be able to use this structure in. Step number 3, anticipation. You need to anticipate all kinds of forms that you are going to use that structure in. We started from a question form. What would be the positive answer? I've been living in the UK for 5 years. What would be the negative? No, I haven't been living here for long. If you're learning a phrasal verb or an idiom, you might also anticipate forms in the past, in the present, in the future. You might be able to use the conditional. So you need to think of all possible forms you are going to need to use that structure in. And you need to associate the sounds to the different kinds of forms. So if, for example, you are asking a question to somebody directly, you are going to have the sound have. So how long have you been living in the UK for? But let's say you want to ask a question about a third person. In that case, the sound will be has. So how long has she been living in the UK for? How long has he been living in the UK for? So instead of have, you will have has. Have you? Has she? Have you? Has he? In a positive statement, the same. I've been living in the UK for many years. You need to produce the v sound. I've been living in the UK for many years. If you are referring to a third person, he or she, you are going to have the sound z. She's been living in the UK for many years. He's been living in the UK for many years. So anticipate different situations, different forms, and associate them with different sounds. Step number 4 and last step is make it stick. Make the language stick. Encode and lock language into long-term memory. This is our objective, to be able to use what we learn in the long term, unless you're just learning to pass a test. But I would hope that you were learning in order to be able to use what you learn spontaneously in real life situations. So how do we make language stick? We diligently take notes during our sessions, and then we go home and we open our book and we go through the language, reading the English and then the translation into our own language. That's the wrong way to do it. Because when you go through your notes, you are actually creating the illusion of learning. You are giving yourself the impression that everything is easy, that you know everything, that everything is clear. You read your sentences, how long have you been living in the UK for? And you say, yes, I know this is clear, I know the rule, I recognize the words, I know it. Then, under pressure, in a real life situation, you go blank. You cannot easily retrieve that information, bring it back to memory. So instead of going through your notes and creating this illusion of learning, you need to simulate the exact mental process that you go through in real life. In a real life situation, you have a thought and you want to put it into words and then produce those sounds. So we need to do the same during practice. How do we do that? Post-it notes. We take a post-it note and we either write a sentence in our own language, or in this case, we can draw a timeline and we can highlight the period of time that we are referring to, past and present. So when I pick up a post-it note, I have a look at the picture. I try to translate that thought into chunks of language. And I remember the fixed part needs to be automatic. How long have you been? And then I add the verb that I need in that situation, living in the UK for. And then I check. This is my feedback. This is how I check whether I've said the right thing or not. So instead of reading your notes in English and having the impression that you know them, you read the sentence in your own language and you try to retrieve, to bring back to memory that piece of information, and you say it out loud and then you check. You can do the same with vocal notes. If you want to be able to use them while driving, while walking down the street, you download a recording app. You record yourself describing a situation. For example, I have a friend, he moved to London many years ago. I want to know exactly that period of time that he spent in the UK. What question should I ask? And then you leave some time so that you have the time to say the answer out loud when you go through the recording, and then you give the English answer. So instead of reading your notes, you test yourself and you give yourself feedback. And these are two key learning principles: testing and giving feedback. Practicing the same mental process you go through when you want to speak in real life situations. You have a thought, you put it into chunks of language, you transform it into sounds. And again, remember not to break the chain of sounds. Link words. Now, the last question is, how often should you go through your notes? How often should you revise the language that you are learning? And the answer is, you need to space out your training sessions. What does that mean? It means that you should not just repeat something immediately after learning it, because that again creates the illusion of learning. It's something that you have just heard, it's in your short-term memory, it's in your working memory, so you are going to retrieve it very quickly and very easily, and you might think, I already know this, but you won't in a couple of days. So it's really important to space out your training so that you can forget a little bit to then make an effort to remember. Yes, I know, it sounds counterintuitive, is the opposite of everything you've ever done while in school, but it works. The science of learning is telling us that what you need to do is make things a little bit difficult. Because when you make things a little bit difficult, when you allow yourself some time to forget, then you need to make an effort to remember it. And that effort helps you unlock information into long-term memory, makes the information stick. So for example, you can go through your notes tomorrow if you are learning something new today. Then in a couple of days, the week after, every week, every 2-3 weeks, you allow yourself time to forget a little bit. So the key takeaway points from this session are the following. We only learn language in context. We do not learn isolated words, and we do not memorize grammar rules. We focus on the sounds, not on the words, and we associate them to a familiar situation. We try to anticipate all kinds of forms that we might need to use our structure in. And then we do everything we can to make it stick. How do we make it stick? We do not read our notes because we do not want to create the illusion of learning. We use post-it notes or vocal notes. We do not repeat in only one session, but we space out our repetition over time. And we allow ourselves some time to forget so that we can make information stick into long-term memory. Well, if you want to practice some more, make this language automatic, apply this method, download the PDF, download the audio recording that will take you through these steps. And by the way, next video will be all about pronunciation, to be able to understand native speakers and pronounce English fluently and naturally.